Standing in that storage unit in Amarillo, Texas, staring at neat stacks of $100 bills and 3 filing cabinets full of evidence that my own children had been systematically stealing from me for 20 years, I finally understood why my husband had whispered, "For when they betray you," as he pressed that small brass key into my palm the night before he died. The funeral had been beautiful, I suppose, though I remember very little of it beyond the suffocating weight of black fabric and the way my daughter-in-law Jennifer kept checking her phone during the eulogy. Michael had planned everything down to the smallest detail, as was his way. The flowers, the music, even the reception afterward, where our children and their spouses mingled with neighbors and spoke in hushed tones about what comes next and making sure Mom is taken care of. It all felt so choreographed, so carefully managed, that I wondered if he'd somehow anticipated the performance they would all put on. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because the betrayal didn't happen overnight. It was 20 years in the making, so subtle and so carefully orchestrated that I never saw it coming until Michael left me the roadmap to my own exploitation. Michael and I had been married for 43 years when the cancer finally took him. We'd built what I thought was a good life together. He had his accounting practice, I had my volunteer work and book clubs, and we had raised 2 children who seemed to turn out well enough. Donald became a high school history teacher, married Jennifer, who worked part-time at a boutique, and they had 2 teenagers who were polite enough when they visited. Stella went into marketing, married a man named Tom who drove truck for a living, and they had a daughter who was just starting college. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. Michael's accounting practice had done well over the years, specializing in small businesses and tax preparation, and we'd been careful with money. We owned our house outright, had decent retirement savings, and had managed to help both kids with college and their first home purchases. I thought we were the kind of parents any child would be grateful for. Supportive but not interfering, generous but not enabling, always there when needed but respectful of their independence. Looking back now, I can see exactly when the theft began, though at the time it seemed like nothing more than family helping family. It was 2003, and Donald and Jennifer had been married for 3 years. They were struggling a bit financially. Donald's teaching salary wasn't much, and Jennifer's boutique job was more hobby than career. When they came to us asking for help with a down payment on a house, Michael and I were happy to provide it. $15,000 seemed like a reasonable investment in their future, and we structured it as a loan with a very favorable interest rate. But then the payments started being late. First by a few days, then by weeks, then Donald would show up with some of the money and a story about unexpected expenses. The car needed repairs, Jennifer had medical bills, the furnace had died. Always something that seemed reasonable, always delivered with just the right amount of embarrassment and gratitude. And always with the promise that things would get better soon, that they just needed a little more time. By 2005, I'd started keeping track of the payments in a small notebook, mainly because I was getting confused about what they'd paid and what they still owed. When I mentioned to Michael that the accounting seemed off, he'd nod absently and say something about family not being a business, that we should be patient with them. What I didn't know then was that Donald had already started working on my husband, convincing him that my note-taking was a sign of obsessive behavior, that I was becoming fixated on money in an unhealthy way. "Mom's getting really hung up on that loan," I overheard Donald telling Michael one evening when they thought I was in the kitchen. "Jennifer's worried that she's developing some kind of anxiety about finances. Maybe we should just handle the payments directly with you from now on, so she doesn't have to worry about keeping track." And Michael, bless his trusting heart, had agreed. The payments started going directly to him, and when I asked about them, he'd wave me off with assurances that everything was fine, that Donald was being responsible, that I didn't need to worry myself about it. What I learned later, much later, was that the payments had stopped entirely around this time. Donald had convinced Michael that my interest in the loan was becoming unhealthy, and that the best way to handle it was to simply forgive the debt quietly, without telling me, so I wouldn't have anything to obsess over. But the debt wasn't forgiven. It was simply transferred in Donald's mind from a specific loan that needed to be repaid to a general understanding that his parents owed him support. This was the beginning of what I now recognize as a masterful psychological manipulation that would continue for the next 17 years. The next phase began around 2007 when Stella and Tom bought their first house. They needed help with closing costs, and when they asked, Michael and I provided it without hesitation. $8,000 seemed like a small price to pay for our daughter's happiness, especially since Donald had supposedly been so responsible about paying back his loan. But Stella's approach was different from Donald's. Instead of promising to repay the money, She positioned it as an early inheritance. I mean, we're going to inherit the house eventually anyway, right? She said with that laugh that always made me slightly uncomfortable. This is just getting our share a little early when we actually need it. There was something in the way she said it that made it sound perfectly reasonable while simultaneously making me feel selfish for expecting repayment. After all, she was right. They would inherit from us eventually. Why shouldn't they benefit from that inheritance while they were young enough to enjoy it? This became the new family dynamic. Money flowed from Michael and me to our children, but it was no longer structured as loans or gifts. Instead, it was positioned as early inheritance, or family investment, or simply what parents do. When Donald needed a new car in 2009, we provided the down payment because family takes care of family. When Jennifer wanted to quit her boutique job to stay home with the kids, we helped supplement their income because that's what grandparents are for. When Stella's daughter needed money for college, we contributed to the tuition because education is the best investment. Each request came with perfect justification, and each payment was accompanied by gratitude that felt genuine. But somewhere along the way, the gratitude began to feel practiced, and the requests began to feel entitled. More troubling, my questions about our own financial situation began to be treated as evidence of growing confusion or selfishness. "Mom, we've been over this," Jennifer would say with that patient tone people use with difficult children. "You don't need to worry about money. You and Dad have plenty saved, and we're not asking for anything you can't afford." The implication was always that my concern about money was either irrational anxiety or selfish hoarding, and that a good mother would be happy to help her children without keeping score. The manipulation became more sophisticated around 2012, when I started experiencing some genuine confusion about our finances. Not dementia or cognitive decline, just the normal difficulty that comes with trying to keep track of multiple accounts and investments that Michael had always managed. When I'd ask questions about where certain amounts had gone, or why our savings account seemed smaller than I expected, the answers were always patient and reasonable. "That money went to help Donald with the roof repair, remember?" Michael would say. "We talked about it at dinner last month." And I would rack my brain trying to remember the conversation, wondering if I was starting to lose my memory the way my own mother had. The doubt was poisonous. Was I forgetting important discussions, or were these decisions being made without my input and then presented as things I'd agreed to? What I learned later was that Donald and Jennifer had become very skilled at creating false memories. They would bring up financial decisions in casual conversation, as if we'd already discussed and agreed to them, and then act surprised when I didn't remember. "We talked about this already, Mom. You said it was fine." And because I was already questioning my memory, I would assume I'd simply forgotten the conversation. By 2015, they had established joint access to one of our checking accounts. This had been presented as a convenience measure. Donald needed to be able to help with our banking when Michael was having his first bout with what would eventually be diagnosed as cancer. "Just temporary," Jennifer had assured me, "until Dad is feeling better and can handle the finances again." But temporary became permanent, and joint access became regular withdrawals for expenses that were never quite explained clearly. "Dad said we could use the account for the house repairs," Donald would say when I questioned a large withdrawal, and when I asked Michael about it, he would be vague and tired, dismissing my concerns with comments about how family finances were too complicated for me to understand. The cancer treatments were making him forgetful and irritable, and my questions seemed to annoy him. Jennifer, meanwhile, had positioned herself as my helper and advocate. She would come over several times a week, ostensibly to help with housework and errands, but really to manage what she called my financial anxiety. She would sit with me at the kitchen table, going through bank statements and explaining away discrepancies with the patience of a kindergarten teacher. This withdrawal was for Donald's car payment, remember? We're helping them out until his salary improves. This transfer was for Stella's daughter's college fund. You said education was the most important thing. This payment was for the property taxes on the cabin. Tom handled it for us because you and Dad were too busy with the doctor appointments. Every explanation was reasonable. Every transaction had a family-oriented justification. And every question I asked was treated as evidence that I was becoming obsessive about money, unable to remember important family decisions, possibly developing the same memory problems that had affected my mother in her final years. The gaslighting was masterful, I have to admit. They never told me I was wrong outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they would act concerned about my memory, suggest that stress was affecting my ability to think clearly, recommend that I should probably let other people handle financial matters since they were obviously causing me so much anxiety. The message was always delivered with love and concern, which made it almost impossible to argue against. "Mom, you're getting yourself all worked up over this," Stella would say when I questioned why our savings seemed to be disappearing. "Dad handles the money and he says everything is fine. Maybe you should trust him instead of driving yourself crazy trying to keep track of every penny." The implication was that a good wife would trust her husband's financial management, and that my desire to understand our own finances was somehow a betrayal of that trust. Michael, for his part, seemed increasingly distant from financial matters as his cancer progressed. The treatments were exhausting, and he had always trusted our children completely. When they told him I was becoming fixated on money, he accepted their interpretation without question. When they suggested that my questions about finances were symptoms of stress or early cognitive decline, he believed them. And when they recommended that he handle financial matters without involving me to reduce my anxiety, he agreed. Looking back, I can see that Michael was being manipulated as skillfully as I was, but in different ways. While they convinced me that I couldn't trust my own memory or judgment, they convinced him that he needed to protect me from financial worries that were beyond my understanding. They played on his traditional views of marriage and his genuine love for me, turning both into weapons against our financial security. The acceleration began around 2017 when Michael's cancer returned with a vengeance. The treatments were more aggressive this time, and he was often too sick to pay attention to day-to-day finances. Donald stepped in to help, and suddenly decisions that should have required both our signatures were being made with just Michael's authorization. Major financial moves were happening, investment accounts being liquidated, insurance policies being changed, property being refinanced, all supposedly to ensure that we had enough liquidity to handle medical expenses. "We're just being proactive, Mom," Jennifer would explain when I noticed that our portfolio statements looked different. "Dad wants to make sure you have cash available for any medical bills that come up. It's actually very smart planning." And when I tried to discuss it with Michael, he would be too tired or too sick to focus, waving away my questions with comments about how Donald was handling everything, and I shouldn't worry about it. What I didn't realize was that Donald had obtained financial power of attorney during one of Michael's hospital stays, presented as a temporary measure to handle urgent financial matters while Michael recovered. But temporary became permanent, and urgent financial matters became everyday financial management. By 2018, Donald was essentially controlling our finances, with Michael's tacit approval and my complete ignorance. The insurance policies were changed first. Michael had carried substantial life insurance, enough to ensure that I would be financially secure after his death. But in 2018, those policies were modified to name Donald and Stella as primary beneficiaries, with me receiving only a minimal benefit. This was presented to Michael as estate planning, a way to avoid taxes and ensure that the money went to the people who would really need it. After all, I would inherit the house and the retirement accounts. Why would I need life insurance money too? Michael, trusting as always and increasingly confused by the complexity of insurance and tax law, signed the papers that Donald brought to him. I was never consulted about these changes, and the insurance company never contacted me directly. The first I learned about it was after Michael's death, when I received a check for $25,000 instead of the $250,000 I had been expecting. The bank accounts were restructured around the same time. Joint accounts became individual accounts with Donald as a co-signer. Investment accounts were liquidated, and the money was moved to accounts that I didn't know existed. When statements stopped coming to the house, Jennifer explained that they had arranged for all financial correspondence to go to Donald's office to save me from being overwhelmed by paperwork during Michael's illness. "You have enough to worry about with Dad's care," she would say, and it sounded so reasonable, so thoughtful. "Let Donald handle the financial stress so you can focus on being a wife and mother." It was presented as a gift, a way for the family to support me during a difficult time, rather than what it actually was, the systematic removal of my access to my own financial information. The house was the most audacious theft, and also the most carefully planned. In 2019, while Michael was undergoing radiation treatment and I was spending most of my time at the hospital with him, Donald arranged to have the house refinanced. This was presented as a smart financial move. Interest rates were low, and extracting equity from the house would provide additional liquidity for medical expenses and retirement needs. What actually happened was that the house was refinanced for almost its full value, with the proceeds going into accounts that only Donald could access. The new mortgage payments were substantially higher than our old ones, and the equity that Michael and I had built over 30 years of marriage was converted into cash that disappeared into investments and accounts I knew nothing about. When I asked about the higher mortgage payments, I was told that this was temporary, just until we could reorganize our finances more efficiently. More importantly, Donald had managed to get himself added to the deed during this process. This was presented as estate planning. Having his name on the deed would make it easier to transfer the property after our deaths, avoiding probate and saving money on legal fees. Michael, who had always been concerned about leaving me with complicated legal matters to handle alone, thought this was prudent planning. He signed the papers that made Donald a joint owner of our home without understanding that he was essentially giving away half of our most valuable asset. By 2020, our financial situation had been completely restructured, but I had no clear picture of what our actual assets were. Bank statements went to Donald's office. Investment reports were handled by financial advisors I'd never met. Insurance policies and property deeds were kept in files I wasn't shown. When I asked questions, I was told that everything was being handled professionally, that qualified people were managing our money much better than we could ourselves, and that I should be grateful to have family members who cared enough to take on these burdens. The psychological manipulation had reached the point where I doubted my own right to understand our finances. Jennifer and Stella had convinced me that my questions were symptoms of anxiety, that my desire to see bank statements was evidence of growing paranoia, and that my attempts to understand our financial situation were actually harmful to Michael's recovery because they stressed him out. I was made to feel that being a good wife meant staying ignorant about money, and that being a good mother meant trusting my children to manage what was best for the family. Michael's final illness began in earnest in late 2020. The cancer had metastasized, and it became clear that treatment was no longer extending his life, just prolonging his suffering. During this period, Donald and Jennifer were constantly at the house, helping with Michael's care but also handling what they called final arrangements. Insurance papers were signed, financial accounts were simplified, and legal documents were prepared for what everyone knew was coming. I was so focused on Michael's comfort and my own grief that I didn't pay attention to the financial discussions happening around me. When Donald mentioned that he was working with Michael to ensure everything would be taken care of, I assumed he meant funeral arrangements and simple estate matters. When Jennifer talked about making sure I would be provided for after Michael's death, I thought she was being thoughtful about my future security. When Stella mentioned that they were organizing everything so Mom won't have to worry about complicated financial matters, I interpreted it as loving consideration for my grief and inexperience with business affairs. What they were actually doing was positioning themselves to inherit everything while leaving me dependent on their goodwill for basic survival. The life insurance had already been redirected to them. The house was jointly owned by Donald, which meant I could potentially be forced out of my own home. The investment accounts had been restructured in ways that I didn't understand, but that apparently gave them significant control over the money that was supposed to support me in my widowhood. Michael died on a Tuesday morning in February, holding my hand and telling me he loved me. His last words were about the key. He pressed it into my palm and whispered, "Storage Unit 247, Amarillo, for when they betray you." At the time, I thought he was rambling, the morphine making him confused about something from his past. I put the key in my jewelry box and forgot about it while I dealt with the funeral and the flood of relatives and neighbors who came to pay their respects. The reading of the will 3 days later was my first clear indication that something was seriously wrong. I had expected the will to be straightforward. Michael and I had always assumed that we would leave everything to each other and then eventually to our children. But the will that the lawyer read left me almost nothing. The house went to Donald, the cabin in Colorado went to Stella, and the retirement accounts were split between them. I received personal effects and miscellaneous items, which seemed to consist mainly of furniture and Michael's watch collection. "Well, that's settled then," Jennifer had said, with obvious relief, and I could see her mentally calculating how quickly they could get the house on the market. Stella was already making plans for the cabin, talking about family vacations and maybe turning it into a rental property for extra income. Donald was discussing mortgage payments and property taxes like he was already the sole owner. But it was the life insurance that really shocked me. Instead of the $250,000 I had been expecting, I received a check for $25,000. When I asked about the discrepancy, Donald explained that most of the life insurance had been redirected years ago as part of estate planning, to minimize taxes and ensure that the money went to the people who would really need it for things like college tuition and mortgages. As the surviving spouse, I would inherit other assets that would provide for my needs. Except, as it turned out, there weren't many other assets to inherit. The retirement accounts that I had expected to provide for my future had been substantially reduced over the years, liquidated for various family expenses and medical costs. The savings accounts that should have contained the proceeds from our investments had been moved to accounts that I wasn't named on. Even our joint checking account had been restructured so that Donald was the primary account holder and I was just an authorized user. "Don't worry, Mom," Stella had said, patting my hand with that condescending gentleness that I was beginning to recognize and hate. "We'll make sure you're taken care of. There are some really nice senior communities in town where you won't have to worry about maintaining a big house or handling complicated finances. You'll be much happier somewhere that's designed for people your age." The assumption, of course, was that I would be grateful, that after 43 years of marriage and raising 2 children and helping Michael build his practice from nothing, I would be content to live on the charity of children who had apparently spent the last 20 years positioning themselves to inherit everything while leaving me with nothing. They spoke about me as if I weren't there, making plans for my future with the casual confidence of people who believed they held all the cards. But Michael had taught me to play cards, and his final lesson was in that storage unit in Amarillo. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to make the drive. The key sat in my jewelry box like an accusation, and every time I looked at it, I heard Michael's voice saying, "For when they betray, you." But part of me didn't want to know what he had discovered. Part of me wanted to believe that my children loved me, that their concern for my future was genuine, that the financial arrangements they had made were actually in my best interest. The drive to Amarillo took 4 hours, and I made it alone despite Donald's protests that I shouldn't be driving such distances at my age. 72 isn't ancient, I had told him, though I didn't mention that Michael had always said I was the better driver anyway. The storage facility was exactly what I had expected. Rows of identical orange doors stretching across a flat, windswept landscape that seemed to go on forever. Unit 247 was in the back section, tucked away where casual visitors wouldn't stumble across it. The key turned easily in the lock, as if it had been maintained and used regularly. When I rolled up the door, the late afternoon sunlight revealed a space that was organized with the same meticulous care Michael had brought to everything in his professional life. 3 tall filing cabinets stood against the back wall, each drawer clearly labeled in his precise handwriting. A small desk held a laptop computer and several external hard drives. And in the center of the space, stacked in neat bundles on a folding table, was more cash than I had ever seen in one place. The money was arranged in bundles of $10,000 each, held together with bank bands and sorted by denomination. A quick count revealed 30 bundles, $300,000 in cash, sitting in a storage unit in Texas like it was the most natural thing in the world. But it was the laptop that really changed everything. Michael had left it configured so that it would start up automatically when opened, bypassing any password protection. The desktop contained a single folder labeled "For Eleanor," and inside that folder was a spreadsheet titled 20 Years of Theft. Opening it was like looking into a parallel universe where every financial decision I thought I remembered had been recorded with forensic precision. The spreadsheet contained columns for dates, amounts, descriptions, and supporting documentation. Each entry was hyperlinked to scanned documents stored in subfolders on the hard drive. 20 years of financial transactions, starting with Donald's original house loan and continuing through to transactions that had happened just weeks before Michael's death. Every unauthorized withdrawal, every forged signature, every loan that was never repaid, every early inheritance that was actually theft. Donald, unauthorized withdrawal, checking account, $3,200, read one entry from March 2019. Clicking on the hyperlink brought up a bank statement showing the withdrawal, plus a photograph of Donald at a restaurant that must have cost several $100s, plus a copy of his tax return showing that his reported income for the year couldn't possibly have supported that kind of spending. Jennifer, forged signature, home equity loan application, $15,000. Read another entry from 2018. The supporting documentation included photocopies of loan applications with my signature that I had never signed, plus photographs of Jennifer shopping for jewelry that cost more than Donald's monthly teaching salary. Stella, identity theft, credit cards opened in mother's name, $8,500. Read a third entry from 2017. Michael had somehow obtained copies of credit applications that used my social security number and information, but signatures that weren't mine. He had also documented purchases made on these cards, including a vacation that Stella and Tom had taken while claiming they couldn't afford to visit us for Christmas. 20 years of systematic theft, documented with the precision of a forensic accountant. Because that's exactly what Michael had been, a forensic accountant who specialized in uncovering financial fraud for law firms and insurance companies. He had spent his career following paper trails and connecting dots that other people thought were invisible, and apparently he had been doing the same thing in his own home. But the spreadsheet was just the beginning. The filing cabinets contained supporting documentation that would have impressed a federal prosecutor. Cabinet A contained photocopies of every financial document that had been signed without my knowledge or consent: loan applications, insurance policy changes, property deeds, investment account modifications. Cabinet B contained surveillance evidence, photographs of Donald and Jennifer making purchases that should have been impossible on their legitimate income, copies of bank deposits that didn't correspond to their reported earnings, records of cash transactions that suggested they were converting stolen money into untraceable assets. Cabinet C contained what Michael had labeled insurance documentation, legal precedents for prosecuting financial elder abuse, contact information for attorneys who specialized in this type of case, detailed instructions for reporting financial crimes to state and federal authorities, and templates for civil lawsuits designed to recover stolen assets. The most devastating documents were in a folder labeled Recent Planning. These were email printouts and recorded phone conversations from the months leading up to Michael's death, when Donald and Stella thought they were planning my future without my knowledge. The conversations revealed a level of calculation and contempt that took my breath away. "Mom's getting more confused lately," Donald had written in an email to Stella from 6 months before Michael's death. "Might be time to look into getting full power of attorney while she's still cooperative. Dad's getting suspicious about some of the account discrepancies, but he's too sick to really investigate." Stella had responded, "Jennifer thinks we should wait until after Dad dies. Easier to manage her alone, and if he recovers enough to start asking serious questions about the finances, we could have problems. Better to let nature take its course and then move fast once he's gone." There were dozens of these exchanges, spanning months of planning. They discussed which senior living facilities would be most suitable for someone they planned to have declared incompetent. They researched the legal requirements for taking control of an elderly person's finances. They calculated how much money they could extract from the sale of the house and the liquidation of remaining assets. They planned my future with the cold efficiency of people liquidating a business. But the most chilling document was a transcript of a phone conversation between Jennifer and Stella from just 2 weeks before Michael's death. Jennifer was explaining her strategy for managing me after the funeral. "The key is to keep her emotional and confused. Grief makes people easy to manipulate, and if we can convince her that she's not capable of handling financial decisions right now, we can get everything locked up legally before she figures out what's really happening. Donald's already got power of attorney, so we just need to keep her dependent and grateful until we can make it permanent." Michael had been recording their phone conversations. Somehow, during his final illness, while I thought he was sleeping or resting, he had been gathering evidence of their betrayal with the methodical thoroughness that had made him one of the most respected forensic accountants in the state. He had discovered their 20-year conspiracy, documented their crimes, and created a legal roadmap for bringing them to justice. The laptop also contained video files, hours of security camera footage from our home office showing Donald and Jennifer going through our files when they thought we were asleep. Audio recordings of conversations where Stella and Tom discussed my declining mental capacity and whether they could accelerate their timeline for taking control of my assets. Financial records showing that they had stolen not just the obvious amounts from bank accounts, but had also been skimming money from our investments, our insurance settlements, even the proceeds from garage sales and holiday gifts. The total amount of theft, calculated with mathematical precision, came to $437,000 over 20 years. The $300,000 in cash represented Michael's attempt to recover what he could by quietly liquidating assets before our children could steal them. He had been converting everything he could access into cash, hiding it in the storage unit as insurance against the future he knew was coming. But more than the money, more than the evidence of their crimes, what destroyed me was the evidence of their contempt. Michael had recorded conversations where they laughed about my stupidity, where they mocked my attempts to understand our finances, where they discussed how easy it had been to convince me that my own memory and judgment couldn't be trusted. They had turned my love for them into a weapon against me, using my maternal instincts and social conditioning to keep me compliant, while they systematically destroyed my financial security. Reading through Michael's files, I realized that he had known for years what they were doing, but had been torn between protecting me and protecting our children. He had hoped, I think, that they would eventually stop, that their theft was born of temporary financial pressure rather than permanent character flaws. He had tried to limit their access to our assets without confronting them directly, hoping to preserve family relationships while minimizing the damage. But in his final months, as their planning for my post-funeral future became more aggressive, he had realized that they weren't going to stop voluntarily. They weren't stealing because they needed money. They were stealing because they could, because they had convinced themselves that they were entitled to our assets, and because they fundamentally believed that I was too stupid and too weak to stop them. So he had built a case against them with the same meticulous care he had once brought to helping clients recover from financial fraud. Every document was properly authenticated. Every photograph was time-stamped and cross-referenced. Every recording was stored in multiple formats, with full chain of custody documentation. He had created a prosecution package that would have impressed the FBI. The final document in the laptop was a letter addressed to me, written in Michael's careful handwriting and dated just 1 week before his death. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I am gone and our children have probably already begun the process of taking control of your life. Don't let them. You are stronger than they think, smarter than they have convinced you to believe, and you deserve so much better than they have planned for you. I know this betrayal will hurt you more than the cancer ever hurt me. I know you will want to forgive them, to find excuses for their behavior, to believe that somewhere underneath their greed, there are still the children we raised with love and care. But there aren't. The people who planned your future while I was dying, who stole from us for 20 years while pretending to love us, who calculated how to destroy your independence. Those people are strangers wearing our children's faces. You have a choice to make. You can let them proceed with their plan, accept the role of grateful dependent that they have assigned to you, and spend your remaining years as a managed asset in their financial portfolio. Or you can fight back with every resource at your disposal, make them face the consequences of their choices, and reclaim the life they tried to steal from you. I have given you the tools to fight. The evidence in this storage unit is sufficient to have them prosecuted for elder fraud, identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy. The attorney contacts in Cabinet C will help you pursue both criminal charges and civil recovery. The cash is yours. I converted everything I could before they could steal it. Use it to build a new life, one where you are valued and respected rather than managed and manipulated. They will tell you that prosecuting them will destroy the family. They will say that criminal charges are too harsh, that civil lawsuits are vindictive, that a good mother would forgive and forget. They will promise to make things right if you just give them another chance. Don't believe them. They have been lying to you for 20 years, and they will continue lying for as long as it serves their purposes. Make them pay, Eleanor. Not because you are vindictive, but because consequences are the only language that people like this understand. Make them pay because other families are watching, and your courage might inspire someone else to stand up to their own abusers. Make them pay because you deserve justice, and because I couldn't give it to you while I was alive. I love you. I have always loved you. And I am sorry that my death will be the beginning of your real life, rather than the end of it. All my love, Michael P.S. The storage unit is paid up for 5 years, but you should move everything to a safety deposit box once you have legal representation. Trust no one from our family with this information. They have forfeited the right to your trust. I sat in that storage unit until well past sunset, reading and rereading Michael's documentation of our children's betrayal. By the time I drove home, I had made my decision, not just to fight back, but to destroy them as completely and methodically as they had planned to destroy me. The first call I made the next morning was to Marla Adams, the attorney whose name was at the top of Michael's list. She specialized in elder abuse cases and agreed to meet with me that afternoon. When I walked into her office carrying 2 boxes of Michael's evidence, she took one look at my face and poured 2 cups of coffee. "Tell me everything," she said, and I did. Margaret had been practicing elder law for 15 years, and she told me that Michael's documentation was among the most thorough she had ever seen. "Your husband was a professional," she said, spreading bank records and photographs across her conference table. "This isn't just evidence. This is a complete prosecution package. We have enough here for serious criminal charges against all 3 of them, plus civil recovery of everything they stole and probably punitive damages on top of that." "What will happen to them?" I asked, and realized that I felt no maternal instinct to protect them from consequences. "Prison time is very likely," Margaret said matter-of-factly. "Elder abuse is a felony in the state, and they've been doing it for 20 years. Identity theft, forgery, fraud, each of these charges carry serious penalties. The prosecutor will probably offer plea deals, but they're looking at years in prison if they don't cooperate." "And the money?" "Full restitution, plus interest and penalties. We'll also go after any assets they purchased with stolen funds, houses, cars, investments, retirement accounts. They'll lose everything, and it will take them decades to rebuild their financial lives, if they ever can. I hired Margaret that afternoon and authorized her to proceed with both criminal and civil cases. She referred me to Tom Rodriguez, a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes, and he helped me gather additional evidence that Michael hadn't been able to obtain. Tom also helped me set up new bank accounts that only I could access, and we quietly moved Michael's cash into investments that would be completely outside my children's reach. The criminal investigation took 6 weeks. During that time, I had to pretend that nothing had changed, that I was still the confused, grieving widow they expected me to be. Donald and Jennifer continued making plans for my future, talking about senior living communities and simplified finances with the patronizing kindness that I now recognized as calculated manipulation. Stella called regularly to check on my adjustment and to remind me how much easier my life would be once I let them handle the complicated business of managing assets. The hardest part was listening to them lie to my face while knowing exactly what they had done. When Donald mentioned that he was working with the bank to simplify my financial situation, I knew he was actually working to transfer the remaining assets into accounts that he controlled. When Jennifer offered to help me organize my paperwork, I knew she was looking for documents that might reveal what Michael had discovered. When Stella suggested that I might want to consider signing a power of attorney just as a precaution, I knew they were accelerating their timeline because they were worried about something. The something they were worried about, it turned out, was that Michael's accountant had been asking questions. Greg Kloner had handled Michael's business finances for 20 years, and he had noticed irregularities in the personal accounts that Michael had asked him to review during his final illness. Robert had tried to reach me several times since the funeral, but Donald had been intercepting my calls and telling Robert that I was too grief-stricken to handle business matters right now. When I finally spoke to Robert directly, he was relieved to hear from me. "Mrs. Hartley, I'm so sorry for your loss. I've been trying to reach you because there are some concerns about your accounts that I think you should be aware of. Your husband asked me to review some transactions before he passed, and there are some irregularities that need to be addressed." Robert had independently discovered much of what Michael had documented, approaching it from the perspective of an accountant who noticed that withdrawals and transfers didn't match the spending patterns he would expect from a couple dealing with medical expenses. When I told him about Michael's storage unit and the evidence I'd found, he offered to work with Margaret and Tom to provide additional financial analysis. "This is systematic embezzlement," Robert told me after reviewing Michael's files. "They weren't just stealing opportunistically, they had a long-term plan to drain your assets while making you financially dependent on their goodwill. It's one of the most sophisticated elder abuse schemes I've ever seen." The sophistication was what made it so painful. This wasn't impulsive theft born of desperation or addiction. This was a carefully planned, decades-long campaign to transfer wealth from parents to children while convincing the parents that they were losing their mental capacity. Donald and Jennifer had studied elder abuse techniques the way other people study investment strategies, learning how to gaslight and manipulate with scientific precision. The recordings Michael had made were particularly devastating because they showed how much pleasure Donald and Jennifer took in their deception. There was one conversation where Jennifer was coaching Stella on how to make me feel guilty for questioning financial decisions. The key is to make her think that asking questions mean she doesn't trust us. Turn it into an emotional issue instead of a financial one. Make her feel like a bad mother for being suspicious of her own children. Another recording captured Donald explaining to Tom how they had convinced Michael to sign over financial power of attorney. "The cancer drugs make him confused, so we just presented the papers when he was having a bad day and told him it was temporary just to help Mom with the bills. He was so worried about leaving her with complicated finances that he signed without really reading the documents." They had weaponized Michael's love for me and my love for them, turning our strongest family bonds into tools for financial exploitation. Every generous impulse, every parental instinct, every moment of trust had been calculated and leveraged for maximum financial advantage. They had turned our family into a criminal enterprise with themselves as the executives and us as the unwitting assets to be liquidated. The criminal charges were filed on a Tuesday morning in April, exactly 2 months after Michael's funeral. Margaret had coordinated with the district attorney's office to ensure that all 3 of them were arrested simultaneously, so none of them could warn the others or destroy evidence. I wasn't present for the arrests, but Tom had positioned himself to observe and photograph the process as part of the ongoing investigation. Donald was arrested at the high school where he taught, led away in handcuffs in front of his students and colleagues. The local newspaper reported that he had been charged with elder fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement, and that he had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the case. His teaching career, which he had used as cover for his criminal activities, was effectively over. Jennifer was arrested at the boutique where she worked, though worked was probably an overstatement since her time there seemed to consist mainly of socializing with customers and spending money that Donald had stolen from us. The boutique owner told the newspaper that she had always wondered how Jennifer could afford the clothes and jewelry she wore on a part-time retail salary. Stella was arrested at her home in front of her teenage daughter, who was homesick from school. This was the arrest that I should probably feel guilty about, but I don't. Stella had made the choice to steal from her parents for 20 years, and her daughter deserved to know what kind of person her mother really was. Besides, Stella had stolen money that was supposed to pay for her daughter's college education, so the girl was as much a victim as I was. The local coverage of the arrests was extensive, partly because elder fraud was becoming a recognized problem in our community, and partly because the amounts involved were substantial enough to be newsworthy. The newspaper interviewed Margaret about the case, and she used the opportunity to educate the public about the warning signs of financial elder abuse. This case illustrates how sophisticated these schemes can become, Margaret told the reporter. The victims were intelligent, educated people, but they were systematically isolated from their own financial information and convinced that their concerns were symptoms of mental decline. It's a form of psychological warfare that can be devastating to families. The newspaper also interviewed other local attorneys and financial advisors, who confirmed that what had happened to me was becoming increasingly common. Adult children who felt entitled to their parents' assets, who convinced themselves that early inheritance was justified, who used psychological manipulation to maintain access to money that didn't belong to them. The public nature of the arrests meant that our story became a cautionary tale in our community. People I had known for decades approached me at the grocery store or the bank to tell me how brave I was for prosecuting my own children, how sorry they were that family members had betrayed me, how much they admired my strength in fighting back. But there were also people who clearly thought I was being vindictive, that family problems should be handled privately, that criminal prosecution was too harsh for what they saw as a civil matter. Blood is thicker than water, one neighbor told me, after running into me at the post office. I'm sure they never meant to hurt you. Maybe you should consider forgiveness instead of revenge. But forgiveness without accountability isn't healing. It's enabling. And revenge isn't the same thing as justice, though the results might look similar from the outside. I wasn't prosecuting Donald, Jennifer, and Stella because I wanted to hurt them. I was prosecuting them because they had committed serious crimes, because other families needed to see that elder abuse has consequences, and because I deserved to have my financial security restored. The criminal proceedings moved forward with the inexorable momentum of a well-documented case. Margaret had been right about Michael's evidence. It was prosecution ready, with every document authenticated and every transaction verified through multiple sources. The district attorney assigned a prosecutor who specialized in financial crimes, and she told Margaret that it was one of the strongest elder abuse cases she had ever seen. Usually we're dealing with incomplete records and victim testimony that can be challenged on grounds of mental capacity, the prosecutor explained. But your husband's documentation is so thorough that the defendants can't claim the victim was confused or consenting. We have recordings of them planning the crimes, photographs of them spending stolen money, and bank records that prove systematic theft over 20 years. Donald's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal that would have involved restitution but no jail time, arguing that Donald was a first-time offender who had been supporting his family and that incarceration would serve no useful purpose. The prosecutor rejected the offer, pointing out that 20 years of systematic theft hardly qualified as first-time offense, and that the sophistication of the scheme indicated criminal intent rather than momentary poor judgment. Jennifer's attorney took a different approach, arguing that Jennifer had been manipulated by Donald and had not understood the legal implications of her actions. This strategy collapsed when the prosecutor played recordings of Jennifer coaching other family members on manipulation techniques and bragging about how easy it was to convince me that my memory was failing. Stella's attorney tried to minimize her involvement, claiming that she had only participated in a few isolated incidents and that the bulk of the theft had been committed by Donald and Jennifer. This defense fell apart when Greg Kloner's financial analysis showed that Stella had actually stolen more money than anyone else, using identity theft techniques to open credit accounts and take loans in my name. The plea negotiations continued for months, with each defendant trying to shift blame to the others and minimize their own culpability. But the evidence was too clear and too comprehensive for any of them to escape responsibility. Eventually, faced with the prospect of going to trial with recordings of themselves planning my financial destruction, all three accepted plea agreements. Donald pled guilty to elder fraud, forgery, and embezzlement, receiving a sentence of 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. His teaching license was permanently revoked, and he was ordered to pay full restitution plus interest and penalties. The judge noted during sentencing that Donald had violated the trust that society places in both teachers and sons, and that his systematic betrayal of his mother represented a particularly egregious form of elder abuse. Jennifer pled guilty to conspiracy, identity theft, and fraud, receiving a sentence of 4 years in prison because of her leadership role in the psychological manipulation and her prior criminal record. The judge was particularly harsh in her comments about Jennifer's behavior, noting that she had used traditional gender roles and social expectations to manipulate an elderly woman into questioning her own mental capacity. Stella pled guilty to identity theft, forgery, and fraud, receiving a sentence of 2 years in prison with work release privileges after 1 year. Her cooperation with investigators and her agreement to testify against Donald and Jennifer if necessary earned her some leniency, but the judge made it clear that her theft had been extensive and sophisticated despite her attempts to minimize her involvement. The criminal restitution orders totaled over $600,000. The original theft, plus interest calculated over 20 years, plus penalties and legal fees. But criminal restitution was only the beginning. Margaret had also filed civil lawsuits against all 3 defendants, seeking additional damages for emotional distress, punitive awards, and recovery of any assets that had been purchased with stolen funds. The civil discovery process was even more devastating than the criminal investigation, because it allowed us to examine every aspect of their financial lives over the past 20 years. Forensic accountants traced every dollar they had spent, identifying purchases that had been made with money stolen from me and calculating the current value of assets that needed to be recovered. Donald and Jennifer's house had been purchased with a down payment that came entirely from stolen funds. Their cars, their furniture, their children's college savings, all of it had been funded by 20 years of theft. Under civil forfeiture laws, these assets were subject to seizure and sale, with the proceeds going toward restitution. Stella and Tom's assets were equally compromised. Their house, their retirement accounts, even Stella's daughter's college fund had been built with money stolen from me. The forensic accounting showed that their legitimate income over 20 years would have supported a much more modest lifestyle, and that every major purchase they had made was traceable to money taken from my accounts. The civil proceedings also revealed the full extent of their planning and coordination. Email records and phone logs showed that they had been sharing information about my accounts, coordinating their theft to avoid detection, and planning to accelerate their timeline as Michael's death approached. They had operated like a criminal organization, with defined roles and systematic communication about their ongoing fraud. The emotional impact of reading these communications was worse than anything I had experienced during the criminal trial. To see my children discussing my mental capacity like I was a business asset to be managed, to read their calculations about how much money they could extract before I became suspicious, to witness their excitement about Michael's declining health because it would give them better access to our finances. It was like discovering that strangers had been living in my house for 20 years, wearing my children's faces and speaking with their voices. But there was also a strange liberation in having everything finally exposed. For the first time in decades, I had complete access to accurate information about my own financial situation. I could see exactly how much had been stolen, exactly how it had been taken, and exactly what I was entitled to recover. The gaslighting was over. The confusion was over. The manipulation was over. I finally had the clarity that comes with absolute truth. The civil settlements were reached 8 months after the criminal sentences were imposed. Donald and Jennifer's assets were liquidated to pay restitution, their house was sold, their retirement accounts were seized, even their cars were repossessed and sold at auction. Stella and Tom lost their house and had their wages garnished for the next 15 years to pay the restitution they owed. The total recovery, including criminal restitution and civil settlements, came to just over $900,000. This included the original theft, 20 years of interest, punitive damages, and the liquidation value of assets that had been purchased with stolen money. It was more money than I had ever expected to see again, and it was enough to provide true financial independence for the rest of my life. More importantly, the legal victories established a clear public record of what had happened to me. The court documents, the newspaper coverage, and the professional attention the case received meant that other elderly people in similar situations could see that elder abuse could be prosecuted successfully, that family members were not immune from consequences, and that victims could recover both their money and their dignity. Margaret introduced me to other attorneys who handled elder abuse cases, and I began volunteering as a victim advocate for people who had experienced financial exploitation by family members. Many of the cases I worked on involved manipulation tactics that were identical to what Donald, Jennifer, and Stella had used on me. gaslighting about memory and mental capacity, isolation from financial information, gradual transfer of control to family members who claimed to be helping. Working with other survivors taught me that Michael and I had been fortunate in some ways. His forensic accounting background had enabled him to document the theft in ways that most victims never could. His hidden assets had given me the financial resources to pursue justice without depending on the goodwill of the people who had robbed me. Most importantly, his planning had given me access to professional help before I was completely isolated and dependent. Many of the women I worked with had lost everything and had no recourse because the theft had been too skillfully concealed or had gone on too long to prove. Their children and spouses had convinced them that they were becoming senile, that their concerns about money were symptoms of mental decline, that questioning financial decisions was evidence of paranoia or ingratitude. These women had been systematically brainwashed into accepting their own financial destruction. But every successful case was a victory that rippled outward through the community. Every elder abuser who faced criminal charges and civil liability sent a message that this behavior had consequences. Every family that saw their neighbors prosecuted for financial elder abuse understood that claiming to love someone didn't justify stealing from them. The personal healing took longer than the legal victories. For the first year after the arrests, I would wake up every morning feeling surprised that I was still angry. I had expected that justice would bring peace, that seeing my children face consequences would somehow restore the loving family relationships I had lost. Instead, I discovered that betrayal leaves scars that persist long after the practical problems have been resolved. The financial security was wonderful. I could afford a comfortable lifestyle without depending on anyone else's generosity or tolerance. I bought a smaller house in a different town, one where I didn't have to see familiar places that reminded me of 40 years of being taken for granted. I hired professionals to manage my investments and my legal affairs, people who were accountable to me rather than manipulating me. But the emotional recovery was more complicated. I had to rebuild my ability to trust my own judgment, to believe that my concerns were valid rather than symptoms of mental decline. I had to learn to make decisions without seeking approval from people who had never actually had my best interests at heart. I had to accept that the children I had raised with love and sacrifice had become strangers who viewed me as a source of income rather than a person deserving of respect. The grief was unlike anything I had experienced when Michael died. His death had been a natural loss, painful but comprehensible within the normal cycle of life and aging. But the loss of my children was a deliberate destruction, a choice they had made to value money over family, to prioritize their own comfort over my dignity and security. It was a death that they had planned and executed while pretending to love me. Therapy helped, particularly working with a counselor who specialized in family, trauma, and elder abuse. She helped me understand that what I had experienced was a form of domestic violence, that financial abuse was often accompanied by psychological manipulation designed to make victims doubt their own perceptions. She helped me recognize that my anger was appropriate and healthy, that forgiveness without accountability was just another form of enabling. The counselor also helped me understand that my children's behavior reflected fundamental character flaws that had probably existed for years before I recognized them. The entitlement, the willingness to lie and manipulate, the lack of empathy for my feelings and needs, these weren't temporary lapses in judgment brought on by financial pressure. They were core personality traits that had shaped their approach to relationships throughout their adult lives. Your children didn't become different people, though, the counselor told me during one particularly difficult session. They just stopped pretending to be the people you wanted them to be. The manipulation and exploitation you discovered weren't new behaviors. They were the logical extension of attitudes and values that had been developing for decades. This was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant that the loving family relationships I remembered might have been largely one-sided, that I had been giving genuine care and receiving calculated performance in return. But liberating because it meant that I wasn't responsible for fixing or saving relationships that had never been authentic. 5 years have passed since that April morning when the arrests were made. Donald was released from prison after serving 2 years of his sentence, and he moved to another state where he works as a night security guard and lives in a rental apartment. His ex-wife Jennifer was released after 3 years and moved back to her hometown, where she works at a discount store and drives a 15-year-old car. Stella completed her sentence and still lives in our old town, working part-time while her husband drives truck to pay off the restitution they still owe. None of them have contacted me since the criminal trials ended. I assume they tell people that I'm a vindictive old woman who destroyed her own family over money, and maybe that's how they need to see the situation to live with themselves. They certainly can't acknowledge that they spent 20 years systematically stealing from their parents, or that they planned to have me declared incompetent so they could steal more. The grandchildren, Donald and Stella's children, send birthday cards occasionally, and I respond politely but don't encourage deeper contact. Stella's daughter, who is now in college, wrote me a letter last year, apologizing for her mother's behavior and thanking me for not letting them steal her college fund. She said she had used some of the recovered money to pay for school and that she was studying criminal justice because she wanted to help other families who had experienced financial abuse. That letter was the first contact from any family member that felt genuine rather than calculated, and it gave me hope that at least one person from the next generation had learned something valuable from our family's destruction. But it also reminded me that the consequences of Donald and Stella's choices extended far beyond their own lives, affecting children who had done nothing wrong but who would spend years rebuilding trust and financial security that their parents had destroyed. I'm 77 now, and I live exactly as I choose. I travel when I want to. I finally took that trip to Ireland that I had been planning for 30 years. I eat what appeals to me, buy books that interest me, and donate to charities that align with my values. My house is decorated to my taste, not arranged to accommodate family gatherings that were always more obligation than pleasure. My schedule is entirely my own. I volunteer at the Legal Aid Clinic 3 days a week, helping other elderly people navigate the aftermath of financial exploitation. I attend a book club where intelligent women discuss literature and current events without anyone suggesting that my opinions are symptoms of cognitive decline. I have lunch with Marla Adams once a month, and she has become a genuine friend, one of the few people who knows my complete story and understands why I made the choices I did. The loneliness was difficult at first. After 43 years of marriage and decades of believing that family was the most important thing in life, learning to value solitude took time. But I discovered that being alone is very different from being lonely, and that independence has pleasures that I had never been allowed to experience. No one questions my decisions or second-guesses my choices. No one treats me like I'm becoming senile when I forget minor details. No one makes plans for my future without consulting me. I can eat dinner at 10 o'clock if I want to, or skip dinner altogether. I can watch documentaries that interest me instead of sitting through family gatherings where I was tolerated rather than valued. The financial security Michael's planning provided has allowed me to age with dignity rather than desperation. I have excellent health care, a comfortable home, and enough money to hire help when I need it without depending on family members who might view caregiving as an opportunity for further exploitation. I have established a trust that will be impossible for anyone to contest or manipulate, and I have named the Legal Aid Clinic as the primary beneficiary. Most importantly, I have learned to trust my own judgment again. When something seems wrong, I investigate rather than accepting someone else's explanation. When I don't understand a financial decision, I ask questions until I get satisfactory answers. When people suggest that I'm too old or too confused to handle my own affairs, I remind them that I successfully prosecuted 3 family members for elder fraud and recovered nearly $1 million through civil litigation. The storage unit key sits in my jewelry box as a reminder that sometimes the most important doors are the ones other people never expected you to open. Michael's final gift wasn't just the evidence that freed me from my children's schemes, it was the reminder that I was worth protecting, even from people who claimed to love me. Sometimes I think about what my life would have been like if Michael hadn't left me that key. I would probably be living in some managed care facility right now, with Donald or Jennifer controlling my finances and making decisions about my medical care. I would be the confused old mother who needed to be protected from herself, grateful for whatever attention they chose to give me. I would have died believing that I was loved, never knowing that I was simply being managed until my usefulness expired. Instead, I'm sitting in my sunroom on a Thursday afternoon, writing a check to a scholarship fund that helps elderly abuse survivors pay for legal representation. In an hour, I'll meet with a woman whose son has been stealing from her retirement account, and I'll help her understand that she has options beyond accepting the theft or hoping it will stop voluntarily. This evening, I'll attend a community education session where Margaret and I will teach other elderly people how to recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation. This isn't the life I planned when I was young, and it's certainly not the retirement I envisioned when Michael and I talked about growing old together, surrounded by loving children and grandchildren. But it's my life, chosen freely and protected carefully, and I'm grateful for every day of it. The hardest lesson I've learned is that love without respect is just exploitation with better marketing, and that family loyalty becomes meaningless when it only flows in one direction. But I've also learned that it's never too late to choose dignity over convenience, truth over comfortable lies, and self-respect over social expectations. Michael always said that the best revenge was living well, but I've discovered that the best justice is living authentically. Every day that I make my own decisions, spend my own money, and trust my own judgment is a victory over people who tried to convince me that I was too old, too confused, and too weak to control my own life. The key to Storage Unit 247 taught me that sometimes the greatest act of love is teaching someone to save themselves, even if you can't be there to see them do it. And sometimes the most important inheritance isn't money or property, it's the knowledge that you're worth fighting for, even when the people trying to destroy you share your DNA and call you mom.